Hey look, I'm in front of the camera again. That hasn't happened in a while. Get ready for some weird cuts because I'm terrible when it comes to long takes. So today's video is about E3. Well, not exactly E3, more like the lack of E3. The not E3, if you will, i.e. the not E3 of video game announcements that happened last week that replaced the actual E3. How scandalous. This episode doesn't really have a core thesis and is more just a collection of thoughts about what I thought of not E3 and all the direct-to-YouTube videos that many video game publishers put on their channels promoting all their latest games and such. It should be a fun video, so without further ado, here are my thoughts on Not E3 2022. E3 was once the crown jewel of the video game industry's hype-building apparatus. For decades, E3, otherwise known as the Electronic Entertainment Expo, featured press conferences from all the biggest hitters in the industry like Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, and Konami. God, I can barely say that with a straight face. As they showcased previews, demos, teaser trailers, and gimmicks like the ubiquity of motion controls back in the late 2000s in the early 2010s. Essentially commercials that nerds got very emotionally invested in, because video games are many a gamer's firstborn. However, E3 has lost its luster as of late. Over the past few years, many industry heavy hitters like Nintendo, Sony, and Electronic Arts have pulled out of E3's convention space in favor of hosting their own web events via their YouTube channels, as if to say they had outgrown E3. Like an A-list actor abandoning their original agents after those said actors reached stardom, these game companies viewed E3 as an unnecessary third wheel that they could do well enough on their own. This was a big blow to E3. After all, Electronic Arts is a major third-party developer, and Nintendo and Sony are platform holders, Nintendo owning the platform of the Nintendo Switch and Sony owning the PlayStation 5. And as a result, their absences from E3 were notable and felt by the rest of the industry members who attended. E3 just felt emptier. It had become less central to the video game hype machine that it once proudly represented in the past. After all, how can E3 be gaming's primetime event when some of its biggest publishers and platform holders forego even attending? Because truly, Sony's, Nintendo's, and even EA's absences severely diminished E3's overall importance to the industry. And while yes, these companies were arguably in the right to leave, a well-structured YouTube video featuring all their latest and upcoming products is monetarily cheaper and logistically easier than renting out space and putting together a live press conference after all. These notable absences were felt by E3 and those who pay attention to it. The event just has not been the same since then. Similar to Metallica after the Black Album. COVID-19 only made matters worse. Due to COVID, the event was cancelled in 2020, 2021's E3 was entirely online, and this year there was no E3 at all. Though according to the Entertainment Software Association, i.e. the trade group that produces E3, the ESA aims to have E3 return in 2023. Per a statement with Variety, E3 will return in 2023 with a reinvigorated showcase that celebrates new and exciting video games and industry innovations. We previously announced that E3 would not be held in person in 2022 due to the ongoing health risks surrounding COVID-19. Today, March 31st, 2022, we announced that there will also be no digital E3 showcase in 2022. End quote. So that's kind of how we got here. E3 has become less and less relevant over the last few years due to how major companies are holding their own events separate from the ESA, and then COVID-19 has thrown a wrench into the E3 video game hype machine apparatus. And add on some controversies like how the event unintentionally doxed many members of the game's media, and E3 looks worse for wear. An event that is currently being left behind in the past as more viable alternatives like direct YouTube streams become the norm. And to it, E3 has become increasingly irrelevant over the past few years, and possibly close to a decade, seeing as Nintendo dropped out of E3 back in 2013 in order to do its own thing. To be honest, E3 is an old format, one that just can't compete with the modern way of promoting video game hardware, software, and products, especially during a pandemic that makes long-term gatherings with thousands upon thousands of people packed in compact spaces very undesirable, particularly when there are far more safer alternatives available. And with that, E3 just doesn't make sense sense in modernity. And video game companies, whether if they want to or not, must adjust to that. They have to get with the times. This brings us to not E3, last week's major gaming event where several video game publishers uploaded showcases featuring trailers and gameplay reveals meant to garner hype, a la E3 sans the E3. Publishers like Microsoft, Sony, Capcom, and Square Enix all had significant uploads over the past week, and the proceedings had a very E3-like air to it, even though the event still definitely was not E3. It admittedly lacked the same sense of self-importance and commercial excitement. See, E3 was always the biggest game industry show of the year, and a press conference could make or break the public perception of a company in that said year, hence why companies holding press events would pull out all the stops, having hype-generating reveals, like how Sony showcased some new God of War content back in 2017, or in how Nintendo previewed Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword back in 2011, was the expectation. There were always surprise reveals of games that players had been demanding for years. See something like Sony's The Last of Us Part 2 trailer back at E3 2018 that started the hype equivalent of piranhas on their lunch hour. Because speaking for myself, any discussion of the next God of War or The Last of Us would have me frothing at the mouth like the sick fuck that I am. And while these conferences had notable misfires, like Nintendo's cringe motion control focused 2008 press conference or Sony's embarrassing E3 2006 conference, you know, the one with Ridge Racer and giant enemy crabs, these events often cause gamers to salivate in anticipation. We, and I'm speaking for all gamers, become hyped to spend our money on products, which is honestly the ultimate point. This year's not E3 though is different. Many game publishers did not view last week as their be-all and end-all event of the year. In fact, Sony said that their State of Play upload wouldn't be their biggest hype-building commercial of this year, due to how, for the most part, the State of Play was focused on third-party titles like Resident Evil 4 Remake and Stray, a game where you play as a cat, and is therefore my early pick for Game of the Year, because a playable cat. And then there were other presentations like Square Enix's Final Fantasy VII 25th Anniversary stream, which was about celebrating and reselling new versions of Final Fantasy VII, including the more recent and upcoming remakes. And in terms of Square Enix presentations, this was a departure. Unlike past Square Enix E3 press conferences, this upload of theirs primarily focused on the remakes of a singular game in a beloved series, rather than, say, highlighting everything that Square was currently working on. Hell, it didn't really even feature much information on the next mainline Final Fantasy title, proving that this presentation, like Sony's, was far more limited in scope. It didn't go big like past E3 events. Microsoft was the only publisher with a full-blown E3-style extravaganza that knocked viewers' socks off. In fact, the Xbox and Bethesda showcase was packed with interesting-looking titles and featured a lot of respective gameplay, whether we are discussing racing games, shooters, single-player titles, multiplayer experiences, co-op actioners, AAA blockbusters, or inventive indie titles. Microsoft's showcase had it all. There was a lot of content presented, much of which will be ready to play sooner rather than later. In fact, one of the biggest selling points of the presser was that many of these games were, in theory, going to be playable in the next 12 months, like Redfall, the next Forza Motorsport, Diablo 4, Starfield, and many others. And add on the fact that most of the titles presented in the showcase are going to be on Xbox Game Pass the same day that they release in retail, and honestly, Microsoft's showcase was very impressive. The Xbox company went all out on its presentation to the point that it easily quote-unquote won not E3, though that's not really a fair metric because most other not E3 presentations by design didn't pack as much content as Microsoft did. But even with that caveat, Microsoft had a great showcase. Its presentation was stacked with terrific first-party games. The co-op vampire slaying action of Redfall looks like a hell of a lot of fun. The next Forza Motorsport featured jaw-dropping visuals, and Xbox Game Pass looks to become even more impressive in value over the course of the next year. By far, Microsoft was the best of show. Of course, Microsoft winning not E3 should not come as a surprise. After all, Microsoft has been acquiring developers and publishers left and right, most notably Bethesda, the studio behind Elder Scrolls and the recent Fallout titles, and Activision Blizzard, the publisher behind World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, Diablo, Overwatch, and allegedly the biggest sex abuse scandal in video game history. True A+ titles there. And with that, Microsoft's success only makes logical sense. When someone buys the best toys in the toy store, that said rich, gleeful child is going to have the best toy chest. See Disney and how that company dominates the pop culture landscape now with the addition of Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, and Pixar. And in the same vein, Microsoft just owns so much of the market to where it can showcase a massive and diverse lineup of games that can impress so many different demographics. In fact, if the presentation was anything less, it would have been a massive disappointment. The stream had to clear a high bar, which thankfully Microsoft did. It was a strong showing. Admittedly, Microsoft's presentation did have a few blemishes. For one thing, I was hoping that Microsoft was going to announce that they were porting the whole Gears of War series to PC, which is something that is very personal for me. See, I like playing Gears of War's co-op campaigns online via crossplay with my friend who plays on PC. These games, as they are, make for some quality co-op experiences. Yet, Gears of War 2 and Gears of War 3 haven't had PC ports yet, meaning that my friend and I can't play them. And that's too bad, because porting these games to PC is honestly long overdue. After all, Microsoft has ported the entirety of the Halo series to PC, and the same respect should be shown to the Gears franchise. It should have happened by now. Starfield was another issue with Microsoft's YouTube presentation. Despite how Bethesda's long-in-development spacefaring science fiction RPG was the final piece of Xbox's and Bethesda's showcase and featured a lot of gameplay and reveals about what the game will ultimately look like, I was underwhelmed by the combat. While yes, the first-person shooter action looked fluid and solid, though given Bethesda's track record, who knows if this gameplay is actually representative of what Starfield will look like as a finished product, but the combat felt like it was missing important features that make it distinct from other games. Given that first-person shooters are dime a dozen these days, modern FPS video games generally require a gameplay function that adds variety to the combat. Hell, we can even use Bethesda's past games as examples. In Fallout 3, you can pause time and aim at specific body parts through the VAT system, and in Skyrim, you can dual-wield swords and spells, which can be very satisfying. But with Starfield's gameplay reveal, Bethesda did not present anything revolutionary here. It just showcased typical FPS action, and while sure, flying and constructing your own spaceship is pretty cool, and the 1,000 pre-crafted environments that you can land on sounds interesting, Starfield's shooty bang bang seems very rudimentary. It looks too basic. On one final note, I'd like to discuss Capcom's YouTube event, which was pretty lackluster. In fact, Capcom's presentation highlighted a sad trend regarding promotional events hosted by storied third-party developers that includes past E3 press conferences and direct-to-YouTube presentations. See, many big-time third-party publishers have minimized their game output in recent years. Despite how many of these companies have the rights to create new installments in old yet important legacy series that once defined their brand, many of these publishers haven't touched these invaluable IPs in years, often preferring to put many of their golden eggs in less baskets. And those said baskets represent the live service trend, i.e. the type of AAA, usually multiplayer title that is intended to be a long-term monetary commitment that keeps players playing and paying for years. And Capcom's presentation was heavy on these titles. For a few examples, there was the next Monster Hunter expansion, and then there was the team-slaying dinosaur game Exoprimal, which admittedly looked solid because, you know, you fight an army of dinosaurs. And Capcom spent a lot of time presenting these games during their presentation, all to the point that the company didn't have all too much else to show, representing how third-party AAA publishers like Capcom make fewer and fewer games than it did in the past, and the games that it does make are live services, which isn't optimal. Hell, the absence of content in Capcom's presentation was especially noticeable, given that in some cases it didn't have meaningful updates to live services like the upcoming Street Fighter 6, it didn't even bother to announce the existence of Dragon's Dogma 2 on the presentation. It was done at least a day later. And the company's only new single-player content announcements was for the Resident Evil 4 remake and for the story-based DLC for Resident Evil Village, which on the one hand they both look cool, but on the other hand, one game is just a remake of an old title, and the other is just DLC for a game that released last year. And honestly, is that really all that Capcom had for those of us who like story-based experiences? Because that's what it felt like. Like, make no mistake, Capcom is stacked with underutilized IP. Darkstalkers, Okami, Beautiful Joe, Dead Rising, Lost Planet, and so many others. There's just so much that the company can work with, yet the output that they showcased during not E3 was not up to par. The company showcased various live services, a remake, and DLC for a single-player game. And that was it, sadly. and honestly, it just was not very good. Admittedly, not E3 reflected a lot of industry trends. It highlighted the increasing irrelevance of a physical E3, it displayed how Microsoft is on top of the video game world due to how it bought out its competitors, and it exemplified how third-party publishers make fewer games than they once did, and instead focus on smaller amount of big live service investments. And ultimately, that's my thoughts on not E3. It was an event that is far removed from the E3 that we know, but even with that said, it still perfectly represented the business trends, the monetary hierarchy, and how specific publishers view the industry at large. Not E3 was a microcosm of all these things, for better and for worse. I guess this video had a thesis after all. See ya. And with that, that was the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of not E3. Also, please consider contributing to my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month allows you to start making review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones, and David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.